With no further ado, we will get into our two main topics today, starting with our 2024 mini review, where rather than doing the deep dive into the 2024 Player's Handbook, we are going to pull out pieces and evaluate them on their own in a short amount of time each. This week, I thought we should look at the character creation chapter. How does the book teach new players how to do a character, and what do they emphasize? So the design goal, I think, for this is making character creation more streamlined to help the players understand how what they're doing when they create a character translates into gameplay, so they're not surprised. Would you say that's a good goal, Teos?
Yeah, absolutely. And it should be, right? I mean, I just finished a whole weekend of working with countless new players. And I mean, we tried to count them. And it's complicated, right? And in fact, this came up on our Discord that someone said, what do you think about the new rules? And I said, well, you know, let's set that aside for a second and let's go back and say
Mm.
that for Learn to Play, I have what I consider to be my favorite pre-gens to use for this event that we use when we do Learn to Plays. And they're ones that almost look like the fourth edition pre-gens. If anyone did the D&D
Mhm.
Encounters program, they really streamline things. Because if we just give them a character sheet, it's really confusing. And so
Yeah.
that tells you the mind of a new player, right? Too much is just super overwhelming. And so the more that you can distill it down, break it down step by step, right? Teach it a thing at a time. Like, here's how to do skill stuff. Here's how to do combat stuff. Here's how to, the more you break that down, simplify it, give it in little bits that are digestible towards that
Mhm.
emphasis of a new player, the easier it becomes for them.
It was a fun experiment when I worked on Peril and Pinebrook to try to make a character sheet as compact as possible, but not
Right.
dense, and say, okay, what do they really, really need to know? Can I pull this out? Yeah, let's pull out ability scores. What else do they really not need?
Yeah.
Okay, let's
Yeah.
pull that out. Till I got down to a half page, and it's not a dense half page. And so that's what I looked at with this going in was what do they emphasize? What do they say, but sort of gloss over,
Mhm.
etc.
Yeah.
So how did they handle it in 2014? Well, the chapter one was called Step by Step Characters. And they gave a little segment about this is what you're doing when you build this part of the character. And then they did so with a build Brunor section for each subsection for each section, where they showed you, okay, Brunor is going to be a dwarf. So what does that mean, et cetera, et cetera. Uh, just for reference, this 2014 chapter called Step by Step Characters was 5 pages long.
Mm.
We'll take that and set that aside and we'll
Mhm.
look at 2024 in a minute. But what was in this chapter? There were 6 steps. One was called Choose Your Race. You chose your race. 2, choose a class. You chose your class.
Yeah.
3, determine ability scores. 4, describe your character. I'll have you know, nowhere in this step does it mention backgrounds. Backgrounds is briefly mentioned in no great detail under the describe your character section, even though mechanical rules were delivered via that background. 5 was choose your equipment, and 6 was come together.
Mhm.
Again, all of this handled 5 pages, including no small amount of art.
Yeah.
2024, how does it handle it? Well, the first thing is, as we mentioned in our previous chapter here of the show, the designers have made a big deal about this is the first player's handbook that opens by teaching the game
Mhm.
rather than having you make a character or describing the world or doing some other stuff. It actually goes through the rules and what rolling a d20 means and what checks mean, et cetera, et cetera. Uh, So we don't even get to the creating your character section until chapter 2.
And it's worth saying, just for what it's worth, right, that piece on the rules is 31 pages long. So
Mhm,
it's not particularly long when you think of rules in general, right? That's a pretty reasonable read. And
mhm,
well, it's really hard for us, people like us who've been playing, to properly assess that chapter. But I think it does a pretty good job of giving you what you
mhm.
need to know without getting mired in the details, which is accomplished by having a rules glossary, right? It
Right.
kind of gives you a high level view of the kind of things you're going to do. It has play examples, it has art and layout that
Mhm,
kind of help you get that. But the whole point that when you get to chapter 2 on page 33, now you're gonna know what you're even talking about. Versus before, creating a character was sort of an interesting opening because it said, here are these, you're gonna choose a race, and you don't even know what they're talking about if you're this is your first
mhm.
time reading D&D, and you're gonna have to go to the race section later to even figure out what the options are and choose and go back and forth. And so it's an interesting change. Hmm.
Yeah, and no matter what order you put the content in, there's going to be some sorts of jumping around. You can't avoid that.
Yep.
Uh, but I was happy to see this rule section come first for the reason that you just said. At least you have an understanding of the basics. So when you're making decisions about your character, you have a frame of reference.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
won't know everything, but you'll have a frame of reference. So we get to the chapter 2 then, creating your character. The very first thing it talks about is get ready. It doesn't say choose class, choose race. It says get ready. And there are subheadings under get ready. And the first one is talk to your DM. And I'm like, yes, thank you. It reinforces for players that this game relies on game masters who are going to be the interpreters and the storytellers and the facilitators. So get to know the DM first because they can help you along the
Yeah.
way, and they may have further instructions along the way. So I really like that, and I think it helps DMs as well by putting DMs in the driver's seat and saying, DM, this is a responsibility and a joy. So
Yeah.
treat it as both. Treat it as both of those things.
Yeah. And they don't go super deep here, right? So they mention
Mhm,
like you may choose a different direction for your character if the DM is planning swashbuckling versus high sea or swashbuckling of the
mhm,
high seas and versus Greek myth, I guess. And
mhm,
so yeah, totally, right? But also they don't say things like your DM might limit what options you can
mhm,
take, or your DM may, want you to start in a certain type of city. They don't go deep on this, right? It's just a light bit, which
mhm,
is fine to give you a feel for your DM has a say and affects things. They
mhm,
also talk about the session zero and that you
mhm,
may get together to do things like talk about do's and don'ts in the campaign and
mhm.
so on. And so that's again another thing that doesn't cover all of the possibilities, but at least helps prepare the mind of a new player for, oh yeah, my DM matters, the campaign matters,
Yeah.
and that's on.
And then what I hope is in the DM's guide is a matching section.
Mm,
I'm sure they won't, but it would be nice if there was a matching list that says, okay, DM says your players create characters. Here are some things you might want to talk to them about. When they come to you before they create their character, here's how you can handle things. When you talk about session zero, here are some things you can do. When they're choosing a class, here are some things you could think about. That would take too much coordination, but it would be helpful if there was at least some sort of correlation.
yeah. Yep.
So step one, choose your class. If we go back to 2014, what was the first step? Choose your race.
Mm,
So already I'm very happy. We have flipped the script and said, hey, player, the class is the most important thing you're going to choose. So step one, choose your class. Step two, determine origin.
hmm
Now, what does origin mean? Origin means four things according to this step. It means your background, which they actually will set aside now and talk more about. Your starting equipment, which should come from your class and your background, so it flows in order. Your species, which now is like behind class, background, and starting
Yeah.
equipment, and finally your languages, which will depend on the things that we've already talked about. So it does follow a more logical flow. And I like how they sort of de-emphasize species. I know
Hmm.
that for world building purposes, for role-playing purposes, it might be important to a lot of people. But if we are going to say species doesn't matter in terms of rules, it belongs in that place for this particular purpose. Then
Hmm.
later you can say species may be the most important thing about your world if there are rigid kingdoms or rigid nations that are based on species. But if it's not, and we're trying to de-emphasize that species doesn't mean as much, then let species not mean as much. Does that make sense?
It does. I fight it. I struggle with it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think because just, I mean, from the simple perspective, when I create a character, I always think of that, right? So I just think of like,
Mm-hmm.
well, I want to make a, orc monk or whatever it
Mm-hmm.
is, and that's how my brain always approaches it. And I think most video games reflect that as well, right? Like,
Sure.
you choose to make a dwarf and then, oh, what class is your dwarf and so on. Um,
Mm-hmm.
because it colors the whole experience, right? Like you can think of the video game, right? If it said like make a class, we wouldn't have anything to look at because it'd be a nebulous concept out there. And then it would
Sure.
be like, and what's your background? Oh, you're a sailor. And then it would be like, and now let's finally have a visual of this, whatever it is, a half elf, a halfling, a whatever, right? Like,
Yeah. And I think I don't want to say like old school mindset, but
if you
it
can.
is. It is an old school mindset, right? It's a
Mm-hmm.
mindset of what you look like matters.
Mm-hmm.
And where we're going, hopefully, as a society, what you look like doesn't matter, right?
I mean,
It's what you
mm,
do. It's who you are on the inside, Teos. It's the magic that's
yeah,
inside of you that's important. And so it's I totally get that looks matter. I totally get
right.
that for cognitive purposes, but for storytelling purposes and for purposes of what you do in the world, I think there is a movement to de-emphasize that, not
Oh
to
yeah, for
eliminate it,
sure.
but to
For sure there's
de-emphasize it.
yeah, and I get that. And we don't want to be mired in the real world's place where it definitely matters how you look and your life is different for it. So we don't want to be
Right.
mired in that. But also part of the problem is that this D&D doesn't know how to separate culture
Mhm.
from what you look like, what your anatomy is. It also doesn't know how to deal with being an incredibly different from physique from another and how that
Mhm.
impacts things, right? I mean, that was
Yeah.
all what the game was trying to simplify before. And now we're saying it completely doesn't exist, but also that it's not part of your concept of who you are. And I struggle
Well,
with
it
that.
is. It is a part of concept of who you are, which is why it's still in the game, right? You still do pick your species.
Yeah.
Um, and
Yeah.
that's
And there's,
why
and it, yeah.
with Aurora, right? I wanted to get rid of that concept for story reasons,
Hmm.
but also for the fact that pick what you're made of
Right.
trait wise, but don't tie it to this idea that because you are an elf, you have to be this way. Because you are a dwarf, you have to be this way.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I don't know. We could go on this forever, right? Because it is such a deep
We
thing
could.
from
Yeah.
the perspective of really the order of creating things.
Hmm.
For me, I don't know that I'm making characters where it's a final step, right? And I don't I have trouble believing I will approach it that way mentally. Um,
Hmm.
because I do want to be part of the setting, and to me, that's a big part of it. It's part of how I will shape the personality I have is based on the fact that I'm a dwarven smith or I'm a whatever. I'm not just a smith, and then all of a sudden, oh, and I'm a dwarven smith. I've discovered this, right? Like it to
Mhm.
me, it's a far more integral piece that's going on, and that I think about it. But I've talked to other folks who say like, the first thing I'm thinking of is I'm making a barbarian, and then later I
Mhm.
figure out what kind. Um, so it'll be interesting to see. I mean, and I get why they do it. Part of it is what you're talking about, but part of it is also because they have moved all of these items to the background, then the mechanical weight is no longer on the species. And that
Right.
means it should come later because it's not necessarily driving these things. And we still have, I mean, like if you look at 2014, it kind of makes sense mechanically, right? You choose the race,
Mhm.
which locks in certain things like ability score bonuses and
Ability
whatever,
scores. Right.
right?
Right.
And various features and weapons that you're proficient in and so on. And then you get the class, and that fills out the rest of them. And then we
Mhm.
do our final ability score thing so we can fill out the rest of the character sheet, right? And you add a background on it because that's sort of just an extra little nice thing. Now we have to go and say, all right, you're choosing your class because that's now the highest concept we will go for. Because if we didn't, we'd be really messed up, right? So
Mhm.
then we go to our background, and our background is going to add feats and all of this. But to me, I still don't. I don't quite jive with that, right? And maybe I will. But to me, we're saying too much about our character without knowing enough. Like I don't feel like it lines up in the right way, except mechanically, right? To me, mechanically, sure, you're
Mhm.
trying to say like, oh, here are your ability scores, so we got them through the background, so that's got to move up in order and so on. But
Yeah.
yeah, to me, it's not narratively in the order that I
Mhm.
want it in.
Yeah. Yeah. I can understand why. Well, speaking of ability score, step three is determine ability score. And as we have this succession, I'm like, no, I want this to be step two now. I want step one, choose your class.
Yeah,
Step two, these are the ability
me too.
scores you want to take. Then step three, the other stuff. But since it's there, they give us the three ways you can do them now:
Hmm.
standard array, random generation, or point cost. It used to be point buy. And shame on wizards for being the cowards not to put the axe to ability scores and not just use modifiers.
Yeah.
Uh, but yeah, that's just my little
No, I
personal
mean,
hot take there.
I was watching a video with the designers of third edition, and they're talking about how close they came to remove it. I think it was something Monty Cook
Mhm.
wanted to do, and some of the others. And at the end of it, they just couldn't do it way back then,
Mhm.
right? And we keep going forward. Probably one
Yeah.
edition will eventually do it, but it's not this one. There's still sort of too much out there that they're thinking of, and yeah,
Mhm. And we also get a standard array chart by class. So standard array by class chart, which says
yeah.
if you're a barbarian, these are what you should take. You don't have to, but you will be
Hmm.
okay. You won't be handicapping your most powerful abilities if you do this.
Yeah.
And I like that. I think it's pretty clear for players, especially new players, to say, all right, I just want to make a character. I don't want to deal with rolling dice or point buys or anything. I'm just going to do this. Uh, and then the next step, of course, is choose your ability modifier. So once you know your score, the chart only goes to 20. And I guess that makes sense in the fact that you're not going to have a higher than number than that
At this time, yeah.
at this time, but it will go up probably later. So
Yeah.
I thought that was strange that the chart ended there.
And one of my
Uh,
friends this weekend was noting that they also state that 30 is truly the cap, which was a little unclear from the way 2014 talked about things. Now you know that.
yeah. Then it says describe your appearance and personality. And it's odd to me that you put that there. And I guess it's got to be put somewhere. So there it goes. But then following that, we get a bunch of charts that show roll a d4 if you have a high strength, and that will describe your character. So if you have a high strength and you roll a d4, you could be muscular, sinewy, protective, or direct. And I'm like, can you not be direct or protective if you're not strong? And so this just went in just
Mhm.
a weird way for me. It's like what I'm saying about species. It's like
Yeah.
don't let species tell you who you are. Don't let your ability scores tell you your personality or your sure, if you have a high strength, you might look muscular. Totally
Well,
reasonable.
and this is also devoid of culture, right? This, which is to me a giant mistake here, because you can envision a lot of species that would tend to live in cultures, depending on the world and the setting, where these things would not be true, right?
Mhm.
I can imagine elves not thinking that you're protective when you're muscular or whatever, like when you're high
Right,
strength. Like, in fact, it could
right,
be you're protective when you are intelligent, right? Would make
right,
more sense to me for your typical elven setting, right?
right.
And yeah, and it's just hmm.
Yeah, it sort of goes in a different direction than I want the
Mhm.
game to go. Is it horrible? No, but it doesn't do all that much for me, and I don't think it helps a player. Let the rules
Yeah.
teach the rules here. Don't try to tell the player how to play their character,
And I feel
if
like
that
there've been
makes
better
sense.
attempts in the past to sort of say, what does a score signify?
Yeah,
That has said, sort of, it doesn't just mean this one thing, it can mean a number of things. Or it's sort of like charisma is a
right,
classic example. It doesn't mean that you're just physically attractive. It's not
right,
about whether you're a pinup. It's all these other factors that help you inspire attention,
mhm,
lead people, get someone's ear, right? Those kinds of things. And same thing with intelligence or any of these abilities. And so that to me is more useful, that could shape you thinking about what your ability scores mean to you, than to
mhm,
state, yeah, this table driven by strength or what, any ability
yeah,
being low or high.
yeah. And then we get to the point, step 4, where I just start
Uh,
banging my head on the desk. And if I was jokingly saying, "Oh, you cowards for not getting rid of ability scores,"
mm,
step 4, choose an alignment.
mm.
I just went, why? Why? There's so many better ways to tell you who your character is. And yeah, we've been around and
Yeah,
around and around on this.
because they're
Uh,
memes and it's part of the
yeah,
parlance. And I mean,
exactly.
I
It's
think it honestly, like, I think alignment came up in humorous conversations a dozen times this weekend, right? So
yeah,
it
yeah,
has that import, maybe even more so than ability scores, where we used to laugh more about, oh, I've got an 18 strength, or this is my dump stat. I mean, alignment
right.
comes up a lot in talk. And so I think just there's just that fear
Yeah.
of cutting out something that has, but it really has separated, right? There's the game part of it, and there's this other piece. What I would love
Yeah.
to do is to have Wizards put in the effort to try to make this mean something in today's
Mhm.
game,
Yeah.
or then yes, if you're not going to do that, then cut it, right? And like we've talked about before, I would have loved if Dragonlance had said, you know what, we're going to really dig into what alignment can do for a game.
Mhm.
Then it may be worth retaining, right? Or if you're going to show me how to link in, use your alignment to create cool stories, that'd be great. But if you're a new player and you just look,
Mhm.
these two steps are rocky, right? The ability score, uh, appearance, personality piece, and the alignment piece are rocky for a player when the game no longer uses this in any way, right?
Mhm. Yeah. Yep. So I will, if I start talking in the third person, I'm upset. So Sean's just going to leave step 4 out of character creation that
Mhm.
doesn't exist.
Well,
It's like
and at
5
the
is
end,
right
to make it
after.
even worse, I'll say this so you don't have to.
Yeah.
There is a table that, on based on your alignment, then you get associated traits, right? So that a
Mhm.
rebellious person can be a result from chaotic, or a helpful come from good. And I don't know how helpful this is. This is
Yep.
yeah,
Yeah. Yep. Because we know lawful people are never greedy,
right.
apparently.
Mhm.
Okay. And yeah. So step 5, fill in the details. And this is where you've made your smaller choices or your bigger choices. Now go back and fill in your class features. Fill in your saving throws, skills, passive perception, hit point dice, not hit dice, hit point dice, armor class attacks, spell slots. Good. I like that. I like the make these quick choices. They're big, but they're quick. Now go back and don't worry about the details until you get the rest of it. Okay, here you go. And then give your name and the final details.
I like how the hit point dice very quickly switches to saying hit dice because they're just too darn long.
Yeah. Yep.
um, so the other thing that's worth noting is that we get this, kind of never before seen picture of a character sheet, right?
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
it's all numbered, which tracks to these steps. And there are a lot of 5s here, right? Because at the end is when you fill out like all of your spells and your spell slots and your weapons and your class features and all this you end up filling out later. So it's a little, you know, I don't know how useful it is. It's maybe somewhat so for folks to look at
Mhm.
where like okay, your coins come from step 2, and you know
Yeah.
your wisdom comes from step 3, and so on. Okay.
I almost feel like we need a separate episode where we look at the character sheet
Yeah.
from 2014 and
Yeah.
really go through it and
That's cool. I like that.
do an inventory. Yeah. And so that's pretty much it. That's a chapter. There is a little bit on like gender and they get rid of the term like bonds, flaws, ideals, and goals, but then they put that in as final details. So they ask questions like, what do you believe in? What are you trying to do? Who is important to you? So
Mhm.
they get there. They just don't call it those things.
Which is fine. I mean, I think that what I guess I would, what's interesting is that they've given up on trying to have some sort of a system there that
Mhm.
drives role playing, right? So the inspiration bond flaws, etc. I mean, they were too much and didn't quite work, but it was an attempt to try to emulate indie games and have pieces there that would foster, like, encourage you to do something interesting. And I will say that when I look at this process, I don't see a whole lot that really drives creating an interesting character.
Mhm.
Not that it's not possible, of course it is, and
Right.
but it's not saying, as some other, 13th age, right? We've talked about what is your one
Mhm.
unique thing? What faction are you aligned with? What enmity do you have in the world? Like there's nothing going on like that here, right? It's very D&D, and it's sort of like, and now you have
Yeah.
a character, and it's up to play to determine how this fans out and whether you're a
Yeah.
good role player or not.
I don't think 2014 did any other than codifying those 4
Yeah.
traits. They didn't do really much either.
Yeah. But I
Uh,
think that was their attempt, right? I think what do I
it
know?
was
But
definitely
it
an
felt like
attempt.
they
Yeah.
they thought, hey, maybe when people fill this out, it'll create creative, neat play, which is
Right.
good. I mean, it may be a lousy system, but I think it probably did
It
cause people to think about that, right? Because it's right there. You got to look at like,
it
oh
did.
yeah, what are my personality things? And you might abandon them, but at least you understand that because you read this, oh,
Right.
characters have desires and goals and whatever's, and you might not use the ones you wrote down, but you'll maybe play a little
Right.
more that way. Here
Yeah.
you kind of don't have that, right?
And what I would like to see then, you're absolutely right. What I would like to see then is in the Dungeon Master's Guide, have it say, listen, in your campaign, maybe bonds don't mean much,
Mm,
but ideals and goals are going to be highly important. So do that during character creation. Maybe you're going to run a game where you want every character to have a bond, and that bond will become important. So do
mm,
bonds, but don't worry so much about ideals. Ideals will come out during play. Uh, so to keep it in front of the game master, but don't have it so the player makes it and it's never
yeah,
used. That would be
yeah,
nice
no,
if
that's
they
true. Yeah,
did
it'd be
that.
interesting to see
Yeah,
if the DMG touches on that in some way, because
yeah,
it could be campaign specific, but yeah. Hmm.
yeah. So that's it. There's a little bit on level advancement, starting higher levels, trinkets, etc. But for the most part, that is the character creation section, and I am fairly pleased with it, despite the couple of melodramatic turns I took. I think it's okay.
Yeah. Well, yeah, this ties into our earlier conversation about packs, right? There you can look at things through various parts of, like, I don't know, lenses, right?
Yeah,
You can look at through a
sure.
design analysis. You can look at it through, what I want out of a game, as we did briefly with, race species type contrasts. But at the end of the day, this is absolutely two chapters, both the setup and then the actual character creation, that I think people will really dig. And overall, if I think of all the people I met at PAX, they'll have a blast making cool characters with this process.
Yep, I agree. And now let's get to our other main topic, which is the Living Greyhawk Gazetteer, which we have been very carefully working our way through to talk about Greyhawk as a setting, what it means that Greyhawk was put into the 2024 Dungeon Master's Guide as an example world, and just sort of sharing our love for Greyhawk as we go through that Living Greyhawk Gazetteer. And we've been doing the regions, and we've gotten as far as the North Kingdom, and that's where we will start today. You're going to hear us talk more about certain themes that have come up in other regions. And so we will try not to dwell too much on
Right.
them. We will mention them and say, go listen to the previous episodes
Yeah.
where we go a little bit further into why this may be great or this may not be perfect for a setting in our 21st century.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely right. We start with the North Kingdom, and the first thing reading through all this description that I hit was, oh yeah, here we go, another monarchy, another, you know, i- his history of, like, this having been a part of an earlier kingdom, right? And in this case,
Mhm.
it's part of the old Great Kingdom, and this is the North part of it. Which, by the way, the North Kingdom is to the east, but it's the northern part of what used to be that large Great Kingdom, and so that's why it's called that. Even though it's really, like, it's just all on the eastern side, kind
Mhm.
of near those islands that we talked about last episode. Um,
Right.
and yeah, what do you think about North Kingdom?
Yeah, it exactly what you said. The first thing is independent feudal monarchy. Okay, I roll. With strong theocratic elements. Okay, I roll.
Hmm.
And in a setting where the gods are known to exist and manifest themselves in very tangible ways, I get it.
Yeah.
Having a having a kingdom that is subservient to a evil deity will be different than having a nation subservient to a good deity, which will be different than a chaotic deity, which will be different than all that. So
Yeah.
I can understand that you can have some fun
Hmm.
with that juxtaposition, but it doesn't always work itself out to be as fun during play as it sounds during writing it as a world.
Yeah, and this is another difference between Greyhawk and the Forgotten Realms, is that
Mhm.
Greyhawk, the gods are way more involved, and the
Yeah.
religions are therefore a stronger presence and smash into each other more, right? Yes, religion is important in Forgotten Realms, but the gods, other than during the times of troubles, don't just really put their hand into it the way they do in Greyhawk, and so you don't see it. And Greyhawk is also setting written during this from a perspective of kind of a simulationist world that's very real. And so, because it is, it therefore must be fully described, right? So the army matters, so it must be fully
Mhm.
described, and the theocracy matters, and the history of the rulers. And that's bunk. Like, yeah,
Mhm.
of course, you can just say it matters, but you don't have to detail it all out and endlessly
Right.
talk about it. And what it does, at the end of the day, is that I think you and I've been talking about, is it means this is a fairly, decently large section that doesn't really give you
Mhm.
a lot to go with, right?
Yeah. Yep. And the most important thing to me to note is it is a realm that serves the god Hextor,
Hmm.
who is sort of the bane, if in the Forgotten Realms,
Yeah.
Wait, is
The
Bane's in the
God
Forgotten
Bane.
Realms?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay. So I sometimes mix them up.
Yep.
So, it's like tyranny and
Yeah.
might over all who are weaker than you, sort of thing. So you can play around with that a bit. And it's really it's the juxtaposition of there are two main kingdoms that came out of the Greek kingdom. There was this North Kingdom, and then there was Alyssa. And
Mhm.
neither one of them are great.
No.
Neither one of them are perfect, but they're sort of at war with each, not physically at war, but tension between the two
Mhm.
of who is the real heir to the glory that was the Great Kingdom. So you
Right.
can play around with that a little bit, but even then, just put me in front of giants and dragons and let me
Yeah.
kill them is where my
Yeah.
mind keeps going.
Yeah. The this setting, and that's where I feel like this was written as a, oh, this is the historical truth and we must write about it and represent it, versus thinking like, do players want to do much with this? Do DMs want to do much with this? If not, let's
Yeah,
either keep it really short for those tiny moments when this will work, like you got to
yeah,
go into there to recover this lost artifact from the fallen empire, or just let's write something else here.
yeah, yeah. No, it's and
Yeah.
and we've said before that I love this Living Greyhawk Gazetteer as a
Hmm.
guidebook to someone who is going to be doing a living campaign,
Yeah.
and they need that history to give them a little spice to
Yeah.
the adventures and to the things they're working on. But just for an individual game master, uh, there are going to be people that love it. There are going to be a lot of people who were like me as a history major in college, going, as I read in my head,
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
was literally doing it with this book. I'm like, and in
Yeah.
CY 382, and like my eyes are fluttering, and I'm like, oh, I've got to get through this. I've got to get through this.
Our next region, Nyrond, I felt was a little bit like this as well,
Mhm.
but I felt like it had some like saving bits that made it more interesting, right? It's almost like how to take the previous one and give it a little more to it, right? Because
Mhm.
yes, it has all these tensions, but to me, the history of kind of why it is where it is
Mhm.
makes it more interesting with, and the monarchy's issues are more interesting. What do you think?
Right. Yeah, for sure. The monarchy has its own problems. It was a part, of course, of the Great Kingdom, because who
Yeah,
wasn't?
it's just west of the North Kingdom.
Yeah, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so it has an interesting history of one of those areas that are on the edge of a very powerful empire. So they get lots of troops sent there as the guardians of the edge of the empire.
Mm-hmm.
And then as the empire begins to crumble, it's one of the first places to go. So that part, I was like, okay, yeah, that makes sense. I could see that. And then because it was so involved in the Greyhawk Wars, they lost 70,000 soldiers. So just a few years ago, they lost 70,000 soldiers. Uh, and so they are in dire circumstances. Economically, they are ruined. Banditry is rampant. And a new king has just come to power after his younger brother tried to assassinate their father. Yeah, and there's a picture of the new king and the old king. Teos is holding up. And so at least that is interesting in a way that this is a quote unquote good kingdom. It's the leaders are at least trying to do right,
Right.
but everything's falling apart. So there is more room for player characters to come in and make a difference.
Yeah, and what I like, and I wish they'd made this like, sometimes I feel like this sometimes, because it tries to be encyclopedic, doesn't tell the DM, just tell the DM, hey, here's some awesome questions,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
And like, so one of them is the younger brother tries to take over. The moment that a there's a sudden stroke to the older father, but was that magical, mundane?
Yeah.
That begs the question, becomes really interesting. And then it's like, oh,
Right.
the older brother regains the power, the younger brother disappears. Wait a minute, where is he?
Yeah.
Right? Something's
Right.
going on. And then, oh, so the older brother gets married, And immediately the wife has a
Yep.
sickness and she's never been seen since after heat stroke. And it's like, those are all
Yeah.
juicy bits that you just sort of hid in all of this gobbledygook about history. Bring those
Right.
out front and tell me
Yep.
that's the cool stuff to work around, right?
Right. Now the characters can get involved. They need
Yes.
to track down the younger brother. They need to figure out what
Yeah.
malady, what curse has been put on, the betrothed of the king. And
Yeah.
that now I'm telling a story. Now I'm ready.
Exactly.
Now
Yeah.
I'm getting my juices flowing in
Yep.
terms of creativity and a story that the characters can take part
Yeah.
in.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
yeah.
one other thing is sometimes they, they don't point out, like I remember the fourth edition Forgotten Realms guide. One of the things I really liked about it is it would take these little snapshots that it would use for the picture in each
Mhm.
section, and that is both visually grounding, and it would help you imagine, like, oh, there's this forest and this marsh and this thing and this coastline, because those are all the adventure sites, and it
Exactly.
would give you little tidbits about them. And a more modern version of this is the Critical Role. Both of the Critical Role
Mhm.
setting books do a great job of doing that, right? Of showing you, hey, all these cool features you will want if you base your campaign here. You'll want to do this, right? And here are hooks at
Yeah.
both low level and high level, because that stuff's awesome, right? Like you want to,
Yeah.
how can it not matter that Relmore Bay is to the south of Nyrond, but we don't mention it because
Right.
you're just supposed to look at the map and conclude. But that, if you're really going to write fun things for the setting, well, then you
Yep.
want to know that.
We're doing the Grim Hollow transformed
Hmm.
redo of our setting. And I sent out a couple weeks ago to our writers, here is the regional outline. And a big honking part of that is adventure sites or sites of interest or places to adventure or adventure
Oh
hooks.
yeah,
Not like two lines at the end of it, like half of
yeah,
it, because that's what our game masters and our players are
yeah.
most likely want to focus on. And if you like history and if you like that sort of thing, we're not disparaging you. It's fun. It can be a lot of fun to delve into that, but it's not for everyone.
Totally, absolutely.
And speaking of that, let's get to Onnwal, which is, guess what, a hereditary feudal monarchy.
Hmm.
But at least in this case, the actual government was a hereditary feudal monarchy, but the Scarlet Brotherhood took over. And the Scarlet Brotherhood own an important part of this region, which is the capital and its surrounding area, which is on the very edge of this peninsula that acts as a sort of Gibraltar
Hmm.
uh, portal into a larger ocean or sea/bay.
Yeah,
So the rest of the country is run by the rebels who are trying to overthrow the Scarlet Brotherhood's rule over the capital city of Scant and its environs. And so there you've got it's a shorter regional write-up, but
hmm,
it's at least got this story that I could latch onto and hurl my adventures into.
yeah. And I think this was a region that did really well because of that. I was fortunate to play a few of these adventures, which were written in the UK, and they were fun. They were neat, and there were big scenes involving the Scarlet Brotherhood as these enemies. There was a lot of subterfuge because of how the Scarlet Brotherhood has all this spy network and everything. There was a lot of like unify the people and deal with the people who try to profit from war and so on. And so it was pretty neat. They could see what they needed to do, right? This is an area of the world that's very clear, has neat
Mhm.
agency, neat obvious action going on, and so yeah, it was a good region.
Yep, I agree. And it was very near the Pomarge, which is sort of the other side of that rock or the Strait of Gibraltar. And that is also an area overrun with monsters or monstrous humanoids. So having those two things blocking off this one small strait into a larger sea is good story. It's good setup for especially naval adventures, but
Hmm.
also adventures to get in and free that area so ships can get through.
Yeah, and that's where you could think like if you're really going to make this useful, you've got to address that hey, you're a little far away from everything else. So, what's under the waves, right?
Mhm.
Things like
Very
that, right?
true.
What's a place like this would be really impacted by weather and climate and shipping routes, and so a little more there would help you then also make that an interesting setting for players.
Mhm. And we'll do one more region because we're running low on time. And this last region is called the Theocracy of the Pale. And it is a theocracy that is ministered not by the Church of Hextor, but by the Church of Foltus.
Totally different.
And yes and no, right? It is, but it isn't, because Foltus is the god of light. Uh, so it's like, oh, okay, finally a good church, but not so fast. And this is where another problem where I have alignment coming in and telling me what's what when what's is not what. So it's called a lawful neutral world because the god Foltus is lawful neutral, but supposedly good. But there's this one sect that is sort of, yes, we're good, and you need to do the following things to be good. And the following things are do everything we say.
Yeah, big time
And
dogma.
since it's not a monstrous deity, since it's not Ayuz telling you how to live, it's lawful neutral rather than lawful evil. But they're still telling you exactly how to live,
Yeah,
which
and
in my book is
killing you if you
lawful
do it
evil.
wrong.
And killing you if you do it wrong, that's lawful evil.
Mhm.
Uh, and and so right there, just get rid of alignment. But again, this is another nation that was part of the Great Kingdom, and it's interesting because it was the priests of Foltus administered the law and the judges of the Great Kingdom in this sense. So people were sent there, judges were sent there, lawyers, if you will, were sent
Mhm.
there to learn the law, to learn how to administer the law. Uh, and then when the leaders of the Great Kingdom decided that these priests of Foltus were maybe a little bit of a pain, we're going to switch over to the priests of Zilchus, the god of commerce, to be the administrator of justice. Well, the priests of Foltus decided, well, we don't need to be a part of the Great Kingdom anymore, so we shall rebel. And so
Mhm.
now they have their very own theocracy, and I wouldn't call it a fun place to live.
No, this was this region was in Northern California and Nevada, and it was one of those regions that was hilarious to either visit or have their players visit your region, because they would come
Mhm.
in and they may either be like anti-Fultites, or often they would role play being strict Fultites. And so they would be like, "You must acknowledge Fultus of the blinding light," and everybody just rolls their eyes like, "Oh, we've got a
Mm.
Fulton at the table, right?" Like, "Oh my
Yep.
god!" And there was a lot of humor in that, right? But also in character, it was very serious. And yeah, and if you adventured there, you
Mm.
had to be careful with what you did or said, and you had to understand and quickly come up to speed on the
Yeah.
rules so that you didn't run into trouble.
Mhm.
And there was a lot of burning at the stake and stuff like that. And so, yeah,
Yeah. Which is fine if it's a campaign you want to play in.
right,
It's not fine if it's the campaign you have to play in.
yeah,
And
yep,
so, yeah, this would be a good place for the characters to visit, but they would
yes.
not want to live there.
Yeah, and that's such an interesting thing. I mean, you could almost apply that lens when you're creating a world of what are places that we visit and don't stay in, and what are places that we might start in, stay in, home base in, right? Like, yeah, you wouldn't want to stay in under the watchful gaze of Voltites for long.
Yeah. And that's where we're going to end.
All right, so Shawn had to head out because of another meeting he had for a design meeting. So I want to thank all of our masters of the realms, our master of multiverse, and master of dungeon supporters. Master of dungeon supporters, we greatly appreciate you. Master of realms, you are in our show notes. And master of the multiverse, you get this shot out. Shot out? Shout out. See, this is why Shawn does it. Keith Amon of the Monsters Know What They're Doing, Lou Anders of Lazy Wolf Studios, Craig Bailey, David Bastianson, Steve Bissonette, Merrick Blackman, Calvin Bridges, Avalos, Evil John, John Carney, Will Doyle, Andy Edmonds at nerdonomicon.com, James Fisher, Scott Fitzgerald Gray at Insane Angel Studios, Ben Hazler and Paige Laitman, Sean Hurst, The Mighty Jerd, Brian King, Jim Klingler, aka DM Prime Mover, Chad Lynch, Paul Matta, The Mathemagician, Eric Mengi, Anna B. Meyer of Fantasy Cartography, Trey McLemore, John Mickey, Sean Molly, Falcon Neal, Tom Nelson of the Deck of Player Safety, Mighty Zeus, Phil Wirt from the Philadelphia Area Gaming Expo, welcome, Post Fiction RPG Audio, Robert Pazlake, great seeing you this weekend at PAX, Vladimir Prenner from Croatia, Pugnus, Ozymandias Rex, Chance Russo at Drago Russo, Andy Shockney, Krishna Simons, Josh and Lewanika of the Tabletop Journeys podcast, Talos the Store Lord, Jeremy Taloman from the D&D and TV podcast, Tres, Joe Tyler, Marcelo de Velasquez, the Valiant DM, James Walton, Graham Ward, Jason Ward from Accidental Cyclops Games, Javier Wasiak, Chris Webster, and Walt Winfrey. Thank you all. You can join these fine folks at patreon.com/masteringdnd. And when you do, you'll be part of our community on Discord. Love that group there. If you can, give us a review on Apple Podcast or wherever you listen to the podcast. That helps other folks find us. And subscribe via YouTube, youtube.com/@masteringdungeons. And you will get to see our beautiful faces and help folks find us there. You can find Shawn at all the places at Shawn Merwin. You can find me at alphastream.org. And what are we going to do now? Well, I think I'm going to craft a setting where the first thing you do is choose your alignment, and then you choose your species. I think Shawn will really like that. I can't wait to, show him this. It's going to be really exciting.